So, hello everyone. Let's hope you can all hear me, and do continue using the question box if you have comments. That's how we're managing this today. The reason there's a slight hesitation in my voice is there was some crackling, but it stopped now, so thank you for that. Right, so I am going to give a presentation. We're going to do a session on how to choose the right tools for online learning delivery. And to start with, I am going to try to, if I just get this working, which doesn't seem to be now. Yeah, I'm going to ask you a question. Which of these that you can see currently on the screen, which of these are not e-learning tools? Which of these are not e-learning tools? iTunes, Tinder, Excel, YouTube, and Amazon. Okay, thank you very much. It's lovely seeing the data pouring in. Okay, I'll stop that there. Okay, I'll just close it. So not surprisingly, roughly 80% of people said Tinder is not an e-learning tool. 55% said that Amazon is not an e-learning tool. 18% said that Excel is not an e-learning tool. Okay, why am I asking these silly questions? So the point that I'm making is that pretty much any software tool can be used for learning something, just as almost any human activity can teach you something. The problem that we're going to grapple with today is how you sort through a huge and growing number of tools to find the right ones to help you and your people learn effectively. And sorry, I'm just moving the slides slightly too quickly there. So at the moment, because of the very large number of learning tools that are available, it's both easier and harder to make your decisions. It's easier in the sense that there's quite a strong, what you might call grab and go argument. That is, there's so much out there, just, pick what you think looks vaguely okay and start. And it's likely that most things will work to some extent, although you have to be careful with security and hidden costs. I'm not going to subscribe to that today. I'm going to take the opposite view, which is that actually, because of the vast choice of tools out there, it's quite a bit harder. That's the guy on the right. It's quite a bit harder to make choices, because even if you know what kind of tool you need, that's what I'm going to call categories, tool categories, it can be quite difficult to choose between similar alternatives. So the theme of this presentation, of this session, is follow a structured process. Okay, it may appear easier to just grab and go, but my recurrent theme throughout the next 40 minutes or so will be follow a process. And just to be completely clear, this session is about how, not what. My aim is to recommend a process, not particular tools. My aim is to outline a structured process. And if I do mention particular tools, which obviously I'll have to at various points, I'm not recommending or endorsing them either personally or on behalf of UFI. I will mainly be talking about software today, although there's a bit of an issue about when you talk about e-learning tools or learning tools generally, what comes first? You can't decide on hardware until you've got the software, but the hardware that you've got significantly influences the software that you're going to buy. My sort of off the top of my head remark at the moment is, should you be considering hardware purchases in these troubled times anyway, as this can add a lot of time and complexity. So what are the main takeaways of this session, my key messages? If you would excuse me, I've had a cough for a long time. I'm hoping it's nothing very serious, and just occasionally I will just duck out to have a glass of water. So just bear with me for half a second. It's one of the worst things in the world to have someone coughing at you when you're trying to listen online. Okay, so my 5 key messages. Firstly, follow a structured process, however brief that process is. On the slide, it says this could take months or minutes. I have been involved over the last 30-something years in acquisition and purchasing processes that have taken years. And that's, in a sense, yeah, if you're a large organization, a big corporation, that may be the case. I would say that even a relatively comprehensive decision process may not take that long. I've put on the slide it might only take minutes. Certainly you can run through this process that I'm going to outline in an hour or two. Secondly, identify your required categories of tool. I talk a lot about categories based on your training method. How are you going to train people determines the category of tool that you need. Thirdly, you select your tools from within these categories. Fourthly, it's such a good idea just to build on what you already know and what you already have, and then fairly obviously use credible, respected authorities to support you as best you can, and I'll be going through some of those later. Here's the process. Identification of needs and goals, identification of what I call constraints and considerations. The idea is that your identification of needs and goals and constraints and considerations helps you compile a checklist, and the checklist then informs the next 3 sections. I will actually only be going through the first 2 sections fairly briefly because we need to get to the nitty-gritty. I will keep reiterating that a structured step-by-step process is really, really useful because the danger at the moment is you can get overwhelmed by choice or not look in quite the right places. Now, please note that I'm not saying that this is a mechanical or kind of semi-automated process. Your checklist of requirements, as it were, it won't necessarily spit out absolutely obvious answers in most situations, but it will help. So like I say, I'm going to run through the first 2 parts fairly quickly. So needs and goals tend to break down into 2 parts, what you might call learning objectives and organizational objectives. Now, my colleague Dan Whiston talked all about learning objectives in a previous seminar in this webinar in this series. So I'm not going to go into this other than to say that you need to define what it is that your learners are going to be able to do, think, feel, believe, and so on very clearly. So let's just have a quick look at organizational objectives. And these are particularly important in determining the training or learning methods that you use, and therefore the category of tool or tools that you go for. This is a fairly random degree of selection of objectives, the kind of things I've come across over the last many years. So you might want to improve learning quality. You might want to put in place a stopgap. You might want to just survive, frankly, gaining competitive advantage, train more people, and so on and so on. At this stage, it's really worth being aware of what I'm calling here your degree of transformation, or in other words, how big a step are you actually making? And this is really important later when you're thinking about categories of tool. For example, if you're fundamentally changing how your people learn and there's 5,000 of them, you'll probably need a project planning tool or tools. You'll need potentially a range of content development tools and a learning management system to tie it all together. If, on the other hand, you're just putting out a 5-minute explainer video warning people to wash their hands during the coronavirus outbreak, you probably are not engaged in a transformational exercise, okay? So it's really worth noting down your objectives, both learning and organizational, and just being aware of the degree of transformation that you are involved in. So let's move on to the second part of my structure, constraints and considerations. This is called lots of different things depending on what you want to call your process. I would look at learners, organization, and content and learning. Let's deal with learners first. Are you dealing with tens of learners, hundreds, thousands? Do you even know? Are they quantifiable? Very small numbers of learners generally make developing custom courseware not feasible. Very large numbers make interactive live training like this, like what we're doing now, tricky, but it might make courseware more attractive. What's the environment? You know, how many platforms, devices, times, locations are you delivering onto in terms of your learners? What are they using? What are their motivations and attitudes? So, for example, highly motivated learners may need less control and monitoring. Will your learners need rewards? How are they used to being treated, and so on? It's worth noting all these down. This is about compiling your checklist. Organizational parameters. You know, what's the technology that's available to you? Security, bandwidth, GDPR, that kind of thing. How much money have you got available? Will online learning be making you money or costing you money? This is a really important next one. Available skills. Particularly in your training department, what skills have you got available, and what do you need to learn? What do you need to add? What delivery platforms available? How much content have you got? Very important. And what scoring, tracking, and control requirements are required in your organization? What do you need to know about what people are learning? And then finally, and this is slightly touching on the kind of thing that Dan Whiston was talking about in the last webinar, is what kind of content or learning are you dealing with? Is it hard skills, soft skills? Is it physical or cognitive? You know, if it's a physical skills, you know, you can demonstrate things using video. If it's conceptual, you may need diagrams and so on. Formal, informal. Is it explicit? Is it tacit? Explicit and tacit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is about stuff that people can codify, can put down solidly. Tacit knowledge is within us. You know, we tend to reveal tacit knowledge through discussion, for example. So you need to know all this to some level. You need to know all this and produce some kind of checklist, even if it's on a little scrap of paper somewhere, because that's going to input into what I'm calling the nitty-gritty, the three remaining stages of the process, what I'm calling core methods, category selection, and tool selection. So the idea is that you answer the question, what training methods are we going to use? Which category or categories of tool do we need to deliver using our chosen methods? And which specific tools within our categories are best for us? So let's talk about core methods now. You should be in some kind of position to start thinking about the main training methods you're going to use. Just excuse me a second, I'm just going to take a glass of water so I don't cough. Okay, I'm back. Now, I've deliberately drawn up this slide as a kind of fluffy cloud to convey the sense that this is not an exact science in many cases. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list of methods. If you're, say, a violin or a yoga teacher, the choice of method is fairly obvious. You'd use live or recorded video. But if you're training in, for example, health and safety skills in a medium-sized organization, you could do this with a podcast, an asynchronous course. Asynchronous course means it's a typical e-learning course where people all learn at different times. That's why it's called asynchronous. You could use video, PDF files. You could have a webinar. If you're ambitious, you could use augmented or virtual reality. So at this point, you need to look back through your checklist and think particularly about your own and your organization's skills, the technology and the hardware constraints, and so on. And you might even need help from someone with some kind of experience in making these kinds of decisions, an instructional designer or a learning designer. And I would say that even if you started this whole process from this point, i.e. you'd already decided that you were going to run, for example, webinars as your core method, it is worth checking against, or checking yourself against other methods, a mix of methods, and so on. Now, excuse me, my presentation has just stopped for a second. Okay, I'm back. So I've been aware of various kind of checklist systems over the years that help decide on learning methods. This slide and the next one is a very simple, I would call it decision matrix, a checklist that may help you consider certain core methods. So for example, you might use video when you require a high degree of visual explanation, where you're articulating clear procedures and processes, where you need to motivate people. The video can be very, very motivating. You might use an asynchronous course. That's typical e-learning course, pages, interactions studied at different times, where you want to explain things step by step, where you need assessment, where you've got a large number of diverse learners, and so on. I'm not going to go through every element here. And just as an indicator, I've also put on this slide very rough high, medium, low cost indicators and technical expertise required. So the idea is, if you're following the process through, you say, well, these are the objectives, these are the parameters. What are we going to choose? What are our core methods? And the second slide, the second table, you may combine a few of these methods. You may say, let's just take the third example at the bottom of the slide there. You may say, we're involved in new employee induction, therefore we'll start with a video, then we'll have an asynchronous course. Okay, so you're determining your methods. So I've now put up a slide of fruit. And why am I putting up a big slide of fruit? I'm reiterating the point that we currently have a vast selection of potential options, and without wishing to cast aspersions on vendors and people trying to sell you things, they may make the array of choices out there extremely lovely and attractive. And what I'm saying is you're much more likely to pick the right bit of fruit, whether it's lovely or not, the suit that suits you, if you follow a process. Okay, so let's say you've got a fairly clear idea what your core learning and training methods are. You've now got to think about what category of tool you are going to be needing, or category of tools. It's unlikely that you'll only just be needing one specific category, but it's possible. So note that these are just my categories. If you Google this kind of thing, you'll find lots of different ways of dividing things up. The importance of categories, as I keep saying, is that they massively cut down the burden on you of selecting from a large range of tools. It's also worth saying that you can use this kind of terminology, and the terminology I'm using throughout this webinar and within each category, for your research. If you're Googling particular things, it's useful to know what the terminology is. As before, it's worth pointing out that categories of tools, in the same way that different types of objective, different types of learning method, they do overlap. Just a bit of history here. When learning technology first emerged, tool categories were extremely clear. So for example, learning management and administration systems tended only to do one thing. They tended to serve up content and then monitor who was doing what. But now, of course, you can get large-scale learning management and admin systems that will cultivate collaboration. You can develop content on them, scoring, quizzing, video. There's quite a lot of blurriness at the margins, so it's worth just bearing that in mind. So now what I'm going to do is go through a series of checklists within each category, and this would be the kind of process you go through when you're thinking about whether you need a particular tool. So content planning and management. Don't underestimate the importance of these. They can really help lay strong foundations. And you may need some kind of content planning and management system, even if you're just, for example, converting an existing live training course to an e-learning course. For example, you may want to share or develop ideas with colleagues. When I was planning out this webinar, I used a mind mapping tool. I just find them useful. You may be working with remote technical people and designers for the first time. So an online project management tool could be really useful. Producing online learning may involve more complex teamwork than you're used to. So do you need ideas generation, research and surveys, project management, group collaboration tools. Which of those do you need? You will almost certainly be creating new forms of media, so documents, sound, images, animation. You may be creating and editing video for the first time. You may be building quizzes. It's kind of unlikely you'll be doing 3D modeling, but some of the 3D modeling tools now online are so easy to use that you might be. So which of these do you need? So you've identified your category, you're now thinking, which of these do I need? You may be delivering asynchronous content. You might be doing that with podcasts, with video training, video learning. You might be doing simple presentations and explainers. They're very, very common now, simple explainer videos. You may well need interactive course building or delivery as authoring tools, website building tools, game-based learning. And you may need, it's unlikely, you may need what I've called specialist platforms, for example, augmented reality or virtual reality. Next category is synchronous content delivery. You might just have phone meetings. Incidentally, the overlap in this category is quite substantial. You might just need audio and phone conferencing. You may want a webinar like this one, or you may want a full-scale virtual classroom, and the virtual classroom may have a number of facilities that a more mainstream virtual meeting system will provide. You may need social learning tools. So for example, microblogging. Microblogging is things like Yammer and Twitter. You may need blogging tools, of which there are literally hundreds. Asynchronous or synchronous discussion, and you may need collaboration and team tools. And then finally, you may need learning management. You might wonder why I've put a row in there saying none. And this was just a reflection when I was going through the presentation earlier. On a surprising number of occasions when I've been talking to organizations and individuals who are early in their journey towards online learning, I have heard an assumption that basically you can't do online learning without any form of learning management. And I just thought that I would put a row in there to kind of give you permission that you can, and particularly now it's quite viable to get stuff up online using basic tools and track it from within that tool. So I wanted to just challenge the assumption that sophisticated learning management is not necessary at an early stage, but you may need basic tracking and scoring. Basic tracking and scoring could be something as simple as Google Analytics. There's lots of free systems out there. You may need content management. In other words, you may need to manage the various components that you're serving up to people, that you're providing to people, or you may need a full learning management system, which does the serving, the tracking, and goodness knows what else. Okay, so that's a quick rush through saying you've decided on your method, you've had a look at what categories of tool you need. How on earth do you actually decide which one? How do you make a specific decision about specific tools? So here's a little model for you. And it starts on the left-hand side. What you've got already, very important. Use specialist sites and advisors. Consult similar organizations and colleagues to yourself. And then as a final stage, review sites. And I'm deliberately putting review sites and reviewers last. What have you got already? Just excuse me, I just need a quick. Here we go, I'm back. Only just. So what have you got already? This is such an important point. If you have any technology in place, basic Microsoft, Google, Adobe, any of the other suites or platforms, it's quite surprising what you've already got. So for example, if you wanted a microblogging platform, you've got it on Microsoft Office 365. Within the Google suite, much of which comes for free, you've got surveys, quizzes, you've got goodness knows what else. It's definitely worth reviewing and seeing what you've already got. In my preparation for this webinar, I was just quickly looking through my Adobe suite. I was a bit surprised that Captivate, the interactive e-learning authoring tool, didn't come free with it, but it integrates very well, and so on and so on. So look really carefully what you've got already. So what do your team already know and use? Do some kind of audit. And then obviously very significantly, talk to your technology team if you've got one. Talk about security, compatibility, and so on. They may be able to advise on important decisions such as, would you go for a tool which is software as a service, or in other words, which you buy and you kind of rent online, or do they prefer, would they recommend installed or desktop tools? They can advise you on that. Consult specialists and advisors. This is just a small section of my selection of my favorites. There are a lot of free sites, listing sites, and so on. Jane Hart's tool site is an absolute classic. Every year she reviews the main tools that people are using. The e-learning network, UK-based network, is fantastic. Mark Bartholomew, one of our colleagues who gave a webinar a couple of weeks ago, he has a free tools directory. elearningindustry.com, and I've put a link there to various e-learning bloggers. The last four are all commercial organizations, and just to declare an interest, I've worked for all four of them. They may be able to advise you in all sorts of areas, but they're also going to try and sell you something, I suspect. These are some of the major operators in the UK. So you've reflected on what you've already got. You've talked to some specialist advisors. It always strikes me as incredibly constructive how useful it is to talk to similar organizations to yourself and colleagues. I think some of the best leads and some of the best advice I've ever come across is from industry bodies and those that advise in similar areas. And then finally, review sites. Now, these are very useful, but handle them with care. It's very easy to get overwhelmed. Just running through a few examples. I came across the first link. This presentation, by the way, will be available later, so you'll be able to access all these links. I looked at the Tech Radar Tools Review 2020, and I was quite struck how they made no distinction between what I've called categories. So it would say, oh, this particular LMS is better than that authoring tool, which is better than that social platform. And if I wasn't familiar with all these different categories, I'd get lost. But nevertheless, it's a useful set of reviews saying what's good and what's not. If you look at the next two bullet points, a really good technique is to Google or to research using your own search engine, one product against another. So someone might say, have you, for example, compared Skype and GoToMeeting? Well, Google it. And there's a really good review on Trust Radius there. Of course, Skype is being superseded now. The work zone review there is interesting. Slack is a collaboration tool, which seems to be pretty hot. A lot of people are using it at the moment. I thought, oh, I wonder what the alternatives are. And really, without trying at all hard, I came up with an article there where there are 28 different alternatives to Slack. So yes, there's a series of different links there, review sites, and so on. I was just sort of slightly amused in one of the reviews of learning management systems came up with, I think, 200 and something different products. So if I hadn't been, if I wasn't aware as to perhaps clearly what I was looking for, I could easily get overwhelmed. I also thought it was slightly amusing. I thought I'd just put this up on a slide. Because I have been reviewing my knowledge of tools, because I've been Googling quite a bit, researching quite a bit over the last couple of days in preparation for this webinar, I have been absolutely bombed by adverts, by promotions. This is all off my phone from about 6 or 7 o'clock last night, by adverts for tools. And they're from often very different categories. So there's a couple of collaboration ones. There's Camtasia there, which is generally used for software learning. There's Toonly, which is for animations. There's Slack, which is collaboration, and so on and so on. So this again, forgive me for repeating, it again makes my point that if you haven't gone through this very methodological, whatever, systemic process, systematic process, I'll get there in the end, then the process of selection can be a bit bewildering. So reflect on what you've got already. Use specialist sites and advisors. Consult similar organizations and use review sites. And really, really usefully, these days it's been made very easy for you to try before you decide. You might rightly ask, well, how do I know exactly what I need if I've not done this before? Well, there's a range of ways now of trying out different categories of tools and specific tools so you can get a feel for what you need. And I've divided these into 3 types. Completely free trials, well, indefinite therefore, free but constrained, or in other words, there's something missing, and a time-limited trial. So if you wanted an audio tool to be used unlimited for an unlimited period, Audacity is yours. Notely is a free collaboration tool. Canva is a free image editing. And if you're on the Mac operating system, I'm currently using an Apple laptop here. I use QuickTime for screen capture. And there's an absolute raft of free tools. And you can use them not necessarily because you want that tool, but simply because you want to find out what it is that you need. It's not a bad idea to pick a tool in your chosen category and just get to know it. Don't over invest your time, because it might be the wrong one. But you'll come away with a feel for the kind of features that you do and do not want. As an outcome of that, I would advise you to prioritize the critical top few features or characteristics. Don't get too overwhelmed. Don't get too over detailed about this. I was trying to say the word methodological again, but I knew I was going to mess it up. So, prioritize the top 5 or so things that are really important to you. There are a lot of free but constrained tools. For example, everyone's using Zoom at the moment. It only works for 40 minutes and you can only have a certain number of people. GoToMeeting, which is what we're using now. MindMeister, which I use to mind map this webinar, only allows me 3 free mind maps, and so on and so on. Slack, I think the version of Slack that you can get for free is fairly functional, but it cuts down the number of participants, the type of media you can use. And then there are time-limited trials. What you do is you get a full version of the system, for example, like Articulate 360, which is a very powerful course building tool. Captivate's the same, although Captivate's origins are more in system, IT system training. Ableton Live is a very specific music production package. Incidentally, it's something I think I've noticed over the last few days is because, like everyone else, software vendors are absolutely terrified of the economic situation. Some of the trials they're offering are pretty fantastic. I think what I'm seeing is some of these trials being extended. Anyway, the point I'm making is give them a whirl, find out what you need that way. Oh, excuse me. So I thought I'd just end with a very simplistic and perhaps oversimplistic decision-making model. Let's say, I'll go to the next slide and then come back to this one. So it's a grid, it's a kind of decision-making grid. Let's say you're down to a few candidate tools, you've gone through categories, you know your learning method. What are you going to decide? What are you going to decide? based on what? Well, cost is the obvious one. What are the license term hardware? What's the training cost? That's important. You can invest a certain amount of your own time or your organization's money through cost of training. Essential characteristics. This is what I was talking about just a minute ago. What are your top 5 must-haves? I suppose you could also say, what are your top 5 don't wants? What's your technology fit? Check regarding security, GDPR, software as a service, and so on. Cultural fit. Don't underestimate this. I'll give you an example. A good few years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, I was involved in a project for informal idea sharing for a North American company, and they used absolutely dreadful, low budget video recording and distribution software, but that was perfect for them because culturally they were very casual. They just wanted to share ideas. 3 years ago, I was involved in a video production job in the City of London for a legal firm, and they of course use completely different video software, although effectively they were doing something quite similar. You see what I mean? Find something that fits the way that you do things your way. And then finally, and forgive me for this is a sort of slightly blurry category, what's the complexity of the tool? Is it a comprehensive long-term enterprise solution, or are you sort of just making do for now? And if you put those into a table, it may help you to make structured, rational decisions, which is why I then go back to my flow chart. Okay, so that's the presentation. I think we've got plenty of time for questions now. So if there are questions, do feel free to type them into the question box.
Hi, Patrick. Sarah here.
Hi.
While we're waiting for the questions to arrive in the question box, I just want to pass over a question, a comment from Katie, who says, it's crazy how many tools are out there. If you're not careful, you'll spend too much time fielding this information and get sidetracked from your goal.
Yes, I think, yeah, I don't know whether Katie's agreeing with me or disagreeing with me. It's insane how many products are out there. Again and again, I come back to starting from where you are. If you are familiar with a particular type of product, a particular a brand, a vendor, just start there, and and build from that. Talk to your local technical people if you have any as to what works. I also would just keep coming back to this notion of a structured process. If you have a clear list of requirements, and again, we're not talking about the kind of enterprise system list of requirements. If you have a clear and brief list of requirements, and you are able to start with where you know, that I think that will serve you relatively well. That will reduce your confusion. Perhaps the theme of this webinar is reducing confusion.
Thanks, Patrick. Lynn says, could we see the slide with the evaluation table again, please?
Of course. Do you tell me if this is the right, do you mean decision-making model, or do you mean the one further up the presentation? It could be that one, or it could be, sorry, I'm going slide by slide, forgive me. Okay, so there were two, I think, important decision-making slides. There's the core methods one, what training method are you using? And then there's the final tool decision one. And I would emphasize that with both, I mean, particularly this one, the one that's on screen at the moment, this is a rough and ready indicator of the kind of things that you should think about. There are other tools available.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got a couple of questions around specific tools, which I'm not sure if you're going to cover. One is from Mary, who's asking about Teams. That's not listed. Is this platform limited? And then another one from John, who's been working with Captiva recently for VR integration, and what's the future of VR in training? So that's two rather different questions. One is about Teams, the use of Teams, and the other's about your view on the use of VR for future training.
Blimey, I hope I can make some kind of coherent response. Sarah, what was the question specifically about Teams?
Mary says, Teams, not listed. Is this platform limited?
Okay, no, it's not. No, it's cross-platform, and it depends what you mean by limited. I have not caught up. I'm not going to Google this right now live in case I do something silly, but no, again, I'm slightly wary here as to endorsing particular products because I don't want to do that. But no, it's a perfectly viable product. There may be a limited version available when you first subscribe to it, but I'm not clear. I don't know that. If your question is it limited as is it not very good, I'm not going to comment on that. I'm aware that literally hundreds of thousands of people and organizations are using it, and it's perfectly effective. In terms of VR, difficult to quite know where to go with this as a response from my point of view. It very much depends what you're using it for. I think over the years, there has been a tendency among learning technology people to adopt cool products and types of product simply because they're cool. And I've seen some pretty silly things done with VR. Clearly, there are sectors, industrial and manufacturing sectors, where health and safety is a very substantial issue, and VR is great in those. I have seen some frankly foolish applications in soft skills that don't work. It depends on, this is the learning designer in me kicking in now. It very much depends on audience profile, on the learning and training need, and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of a generic response, is it going to go anywhere? Well, yes, it clearly is. It all depends on the specific profile of your learners and your learning need. And I guess I would say as strongly as I possibly can, don't use a cool technology just because it's cool. I've seen too much of that.
Thanks, Patrick. I've got a question from John, who's saying, whatever I look at, I can't see a way of offering our training securely to our students only. Any advice?
Oh, blimey. I don't understand the problem. Do you want to get in touch? I don't understand the problem. I think I'd want to know a lot more about your system and what you're doing, because I can't see any way. I can't see why that's a problem. Unless you're just distributing stuff on the open internet on the web, then no, I don't. Sorry, I'd need to know a lot more about that to respond. Sorry.
Okay, well, John might come back to us in the question box.
Okay.
Something to return to there. Then David is concerned about safeguarding issues, and it says that, like, for example, the safeguarding issues on Zoom have been well publicized. Any comments on how you can address this when you're selecting a tool? That's a tricky one, I guess, partly because it depends on, well, obviously the degree of safeguarding, the profile of your learners and so on. Forgive me if this is a glib answer, but if you are at the point where you know your tool category and you have a list of
candidate tools, shall we say, just do your research. Just, you know, just Google it specifically against the word safeguarding and see what you come up with. I'm sorry if this isn't incredibly helpful, but in a way, the example of Zoom is a very good one. And again, I'm not recommending or the opposite. 2-3 months ago, Zoom was just another tool amongst many that did broadly similar things. For whatever reason, it's had this explosive, well, we know why it has because of the virus, but for some reason, it seems to have become part of common vocabulary. And people have been looking at it a lot harder. There are problems with it and with all such tools, and the vendors will attempt to resolve those problems as best they can over time. So I could say to you, oh, well, don't use Zoom, use something else. And then tomorrow, something else would be worse than Zoom and Zoom would be better. I'm sorry if that's not a particularly concrete answer, but do your research.
Thanks, Patrick. There's a question here from Sam, which I can maybe partly answer, because Sam says there are some great tools out there, but as you say, there are so many. From our organization, it's got to a point where we have to evaluate the benefit of training an employee in a new product or paying a freelancer firm to do it. Do you have any recommended tools for finding freelancers stroke companies? And what I'm going to say is that in Dan's presentation, a copy of which is up on our resources page, he did list a few links to places where you can go to start for freelancers. It's in the slides towards the back of this presentation. And Dan was very careful to point out that there are other ways available. Do you want to make any further comments on that, Patrick?
I had a couple of thoughts. I think maybe I should have mentioned them in the presentation. So some of the very large learning technology companies are, you know, supremely well informed, of course. It just occasionally, it can be worth giving them a call and seeing who can help. Now, clearly they're going to try and sell you something else as well, but they're very well informed. So that's one. Yeah, no, I'll leave it at that. It just occasionally it's worth looking up the really big organizations. I mentioned, I think 3 or 4 of them in the presentation. They're supremely well informed. Gosh, forgive me, now it really sounds like I'm advocating them. I'm not. What I'm saying is because of the scale of their investment in understanding the business, they know stuff, and a quick call can be useful.
Thanks.
I feel I may have transgressed, forgive me. John
is saying, John is concerned about how he can secure online tutorials so that their competitors don't copy them, because he's a vocational commercial training provider. So this is a commercial business.
Right.
And if we offer online tutorials, how can that be secured so our competitors cannot copy it?
It depends on the platform you use. For example, if you were to use, so if you're publishing, shall we say, raw web pages with text and images, anyone can copy the text and copy the images. Okay. If you were to use an online delivery tool, one of these, what I call an authoring tool, and I mentioned a couple. Articulate, Captivate, there's Elucidate, there's loads and loads and loads. A competitor may do screenshots, but they wouldn't be able to replicate the whole thing. They wouldn't just be able to copy and paste the whole thing. To some extent, copying of content is pretty tricky to prevent. So the other avenue is clearly to password protect what is available publicly. Which is again a very common feature of most of these tools. So you can launch the thing, but no one except a designated user can actually access it. Of course, that doesn't prevent your competitors from subscribing, getting a password, and then copying it. it's a tricky one. The key thing to do is to use a tool that makes duplication as hard as possible.
Thank you. There's quite an interesting question from David, and David says, does UFI have an online etiquette guide to encourage best practice with learners? And the second half is, should there be one?
Oh, blimey, what do you think we mean by etiquette here, Sarah? Etiquette.
I think what that is about how to run an, I think what David means is how to run an online live session to encourage practice.
It's a nice idea. If I was going to risk Googling it, I'd Google it right now. It sounds like a nice idea. Is it etiquette though? I mean, etiquette sounds more discreet or subtle than just best practice, doesn't it? I mean, there's certain things that one would encourage with this kind of live session, and certain things you might discourage. But etiquette sounds a little bit more delicate than that. That's why I'm slightly struggling. But I like the idea.
Yeah, we'll take that one away, David. And finally, I don't think there are any more. I'm just saying that Carol made an interesting observation about in relation to Zoom and safeguarding, that may not be a safe place to have a confidential chat with clients. And of course, very true.
And therefore, and I know I almost feel like I'm deflecting some of these questions. Google it, do your research, So the point, the point at which you're deciding, am I taking a risk talking about very confidential things to my very important clients? Google, is Zoom secure? Or Google, how to ensure maximum security during online conversation, because it's going to change day by day, isn't it? If you think of the online behavior of all of us now as compared to 2 months ago, it's radically different, and the software vendors have responded. They respond very quickly. So yeah, do your research. Sorry, I just keep saying the same thing.
And finally, well, Lynn's come up with a very useful suggestion to Google. Google Internet Legends has some useful stuff on behaviors. So thanks for that, Lynn. That's a really useful place.
Oh, great, thank you.
I think that seems to bring us to the end of the questions. Do you have anything else, Patrick, to wrap up? I've got a couple of announcements I'd like to make just right at the end.
I don't think so. No, thank you very much, everyone. I really hope that was useful. Yeah, I hope it was useful, really. I'm just going to quickly zip to the end slide. There we go. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you everybody for coming on this webinar. Hope you found it useful. There'll be the slides and a recording will be up on the website at the resources tab. Give us a bit of time to actually get that done. It's not an absolutely immediate process. We'll be running a repeat of this next Tuesday, and we'll send you the link in the email that we send everybody. And if you found this useful, please share that link with other people. This has proved, the how-to series has proved very popular, and we're running, so as I say, this course, this seminar will run again next Tuesday. And then we're running a new one, which will run on Thursday, the 23rd, on how to build your learning business via social media and how to monetize your service. So that one will be up on the resources page shortly with a link to join. So I'm looking forward to that one. So I'd just like to say on behalf of everybody, thank you very much. It's been great having you all here. Somebody says they can't find you on LinkedIn, Patrick. So,
okay, sorry. Yeah, well, oh, it's on the link. It's on the link, I think, isn't it? If at the end of the presentation, isn't it? Let's have a look.
Okay, so don't worry. As soon as we get
Yeah.
the slides up on the website, you'll be able to use that link if you can't find Patrick immediately. Right, great to have you all here. Send the link around to other people. We'll be repeating this next Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.